Humans, rivers and fire. At the supernatural climax of the Iliad, the river Scamander, whom the gods call Xanthus, asks Achilles to stop slaying Trojans in his streams. His watercourse is now blocked and he cannot get past the corpses to flow into the sea. But Achilles is not to be halted, and the river at last, after more than 200 lines of slaughter conducted in his shoals and eddies, brutally retaliates. He rouses all his waters, rushes against Achilles, his flood tide now sweeping away the massed cadavers. Achilles has finally met his match. He's reached the limits of his physical strength. Man can maltreat rivers for prolonged periods, but there will inevitably one day be a price to pay. Achilles can't withstand the enormous wave. He becomes unsteady on his feet, so he grabs an elm tree, but in doing so uproots it, and the tree falls across the river, bringing with it the soil of the bank in which it's been planted. Achilles leaps from the river and tries to escape across the plain, but he's filled with terror, and the river pursues him with a mighty roar. And Homer introduces a simile here that encapsulates the conflicted relations between man and environment that characterise the entire world of the poem. First, the great river god behaves like a stream of water whose course a gardener has tried to divert. It was like when a man guides the flow of a stream of water from a murky spring, leading it through his plants and gardens with a mattock in his hands, creating dams in its course. As it flows along, all the pebbles underneath are swept along with it. It rolls quickly onwards with a gushing sound, and it overtakes even the man who's guiding it. That was how the streaming wave continuously overtook Achilles, despite his swiftness, for the gods are more powerful than men. So man knows how to interfere in nature in order to make it serve his ends, but he cannot predict the full consequences of that interference. For something, the ancients called it the gods, is more powerful than men. The river continues his pursuit. Achilles is incapable of standing his ground against the ineluctable waves which beat from above on his shoulders and drag away the soil from beneath his feet. So Achilles now appeals to Zeus. He'd been promised a glorious death in combat. But now he says, it's fated for me to die miserably, cut off like a boy swineherd trapped in a great river when a torrent sweeps him away as he tries to cross it in winter. So if Scamander is like a stream that responds with unexpected force when a man tries to control it, Achilles is like a boy utterly helpless in the face of a river. And these two similes framing the sole episode in the Iliad where Achilles, the godlike Superman, fired by a godlike Fury, Maenus, is about to be vanquished. And these similes are produced by poetic imagination of an age where men believed there were no limits to the provision of resources guaranteed to humans by nature. Infinity and limitlessness are fundamental concepts in almost all archaic Greek philosophy. Now, we'll return in the second half of this talk to the further developments in the apocalyptic showdown between man and river. But first, I need to outline the reasons for my interest in these two similes. They're a crucial constituent of what I'm calling the poem's political unconscious. It's rich, if undeliberate, commentary on the non-sustainability of the way of life which assumed that natural resources were infinite. Achilles' apoplectic display of rage in the fight with the river, followed by the river's fight with Hephaestus' fire, offer scenes of apocalypse that can be read as pointing to the ultimate consequences of man's antagonism against nature. Human activity, as crystallised in Achilles' increasingly dark Aristeia, configures him alternately as nature's adversary, its wrecker and its victim. Just as Achilles cannot be reconciled to the loss of Patroclus, so we homines sapientes have an entirely conflicted and unresolved relationship with nature. And I need to explain more what I mean by the poem's ecological unconscious. One inspiration has been recent work on what's usually labelled the ecological consciousness. Psychologists have responded to the environmental crisis by linking it with what they identify as the bounded individualistic model of the self that has dominated Western cultures for at least the last 200 years. And that's itself closely related to the rise of scientific rationalism and materialism. Seeing individual consciousness as individuated and separate islands of autonomous consciousness, disconnected from one another and from the rest of the world around us, has certainly contributed to our growing sense of disconnection from the natural world. And this in turn has played a role in ecological degradation through our mindless exploitation of natural resources. We need to encourage the emergence of a more ecologically sensitive selfhood, in which we include the environment in our self-definition, thus realising that conservation of the natural world is at the same time a practice of self-preservation, as concluded in Freya Matthews' landmark study, The Ecological Self. The notion of eco-psychology has also emerged, deriving from Theodore Roszak, who argued that the core of the mind is the ecological unconscious. He saw this as the living record of cosmic evolution, tracing back to distant initial conditions in the history of time, an unconscious that connects us to all other life on Earth. But my term, ecological unconscious, has also been inspired and informed by the idea of the political unconscious, which was coined by the great American Marxist literary critic Frederick Jameson. The book in which he laid out this concept is The Political Unconscious Narrative as a Socially Symbolic Act, 1981. As a Marxist, Jameson believed that history has been driven by the conflicted relationships between human classes, and they can be defined by their basic relationship with the means of production: land, factories, farms, mines, forests, seas, and the work which people do or do not do within the productive process. And since all art and culture, including literary texts, must be tied in some way to the societies that produced them, they can be analysed in ways which are sensitive to and expose the form taken by those ties. Author and audience are usually not conscious of these connections and may avoid explicit discussion of topics such as labour, power structures and wealth. But even evasion is a political act, an unconscious denial. And a famous example cited by Henry Louis Gates is the way that the so-called Magnolia romances, that's novels about white people's affairs of the heart in the states of antebellum America, usually avoid any allusion whatsoever to the system of slavery that made the entire economic system of the Magnolia plantations possible in the first place. Now, there have been attempts to analyse the political unconscious of the Iliad, most expertly by Peter Rose in How Conservative is the Iliad, in his excellent Marxist study of ancient Greek literature, Sons of the Gods, Children of Earth, 1992. Rose's reading of the Iliad argues against the view which sees it as a conservative text, preserving traditional formulae, motifs and narrative patterns in a representation of a static, heroic world of continuity and homogeneity. On the contrary, says Rose, the poem reveals the absolute contradiction inherent in an economic system where the expectation of orderly transmission of inheritable private wealth is constantly undermined by the social institution of warfare. And he explores the tensions inherent in the poem's attitude towards inherited power and plutocracy embodied in Agamemnon, and the greater meritocracy represented by Achilles. And by a subtle examination of the epic poet's own ambiguous class perspective on the aristocratic class, Rose suggests why the injustices and contradictions of Homeric society can be so incisively portrayed. Gender and race critical readings have been successfully welded onto the type of class-sensitive reading advocated by Jameson and Rose. But reading the political unconscious of text is historically not taken sufficiently on board the effects that humans have on the environment. Literary discussion which does this is usually called eco-criticism. And eco-criticism is regarded as having been founded by Cheryl Glott-Felty in her landmark 1996 collection, The Eco-Criticism Reader. She defines her new approach as follows: the study of the relationship between literature and the physical environment. Just as feminist criticism examines language and literature from a gender-conscious perspective, Marxist criticism brings an awareness of modes of production and economic class to its readings of texts, eco-criticism takes an earth-centred approach to literary texts. She argues that eco-criticism, while applied to the time-honoured category of canonical literature, is a result of something far more recent, and that is the troubling awareness that we have reached in our age of environmental limits, when human actions are damaging the planet's basic life support system. We are there. Either we change our ways or we face global catastrophe, destroying much beauty and exterminating countless fellow species in our headlong race to apocalypse. And Lee Medavoy has coined the new term biopolitical unconscious, marrying Jameson to what Michel Foucault calls biopolitics. And that term is used to characterise the point in the early 19th century when Foucault suggests life itself became for the first time a political issue. And that was connected with the massive population growth and demographic changes caused by the Industrial Revolution. Life, plant, animal, human, for which the Greek is bios, became central to capitalism's mode of regulation and to the geopolitical struggle over the power circuits between organic life on the planet and material accumulation. And Medavoy explains eco-criticism, the search for what he calls the biopolitical unconscious of texts, in these lucid terms. To interpret texts eco-critically is to read them in relation to the run-up to a human-generated eco-catastrophe that threatens not exactly the planet itself, but the biosphere, planetary life in all its human and non-human forms. For this reason, eco-criticism takes itself to be fully historical in its perspective and takes itself to be planetary in the scope of its concerns. Its readings of literature work backwards from our crisis-ridden present to the origins and development of either the human attitudes and practices that have led to the brink of disaster, or else to alternative human attitudes or practices that might help us avert it. And the Iliad of all ancient texts seems to me an ideal candidate for such an eco-critical reading. Why is this? In emphasising the human suffering, the immediate tragedy being undergone and anticipated in the Iliad, the conventional contemporary reading has tended to overlook the phantasmagoric description of Achilles' violent encounter with the overwhelming supernatural force of the waters of the Trojans' rivers and ensuing role in defeating the river of the element of fire. Simone Weil's influential essay, The Iliad or the Poem of Force, 1939, emphasised the human dimension of the poem rather than the environmental or theological. Now, that was more than understandable in 1939 and throughout the Cold War, but the continuing neglect, a result of that human-centred reading, is more surprising in the 21st century as the nature of the environmental emergency we're all facing becomes every day more apparent. And Book 21 of the poem, which represents the apogee of Achilles' wrath and frustration, offers us an extraordinary sequence of poetry and aesthetic experience, as if Homer had, into a kaleidoscope, thrown coloured fragments of glass, and they represent humans interacting with the natural world, humans being destroyed by natural disaster. Others represent fire, both wild and domestic, water, both rivers and sea, and wind, some of them voiced by speaking autonomous divine agents. These glass bits also show gods who play with humans and elements as they jostle for authority between themselves. We witness cataclysmic flood and conflagration, the wholesale destruction of life, botanical, zoological as well as human, in scenes unparalleled in the rest of the poem. They offer a vision of what the world might become if Hera had not put a stop to this elemental apocalypse merely in order to save the furious Achilles to fight another day. They describe both what's happening right now in this one river valley, but they leave unforgettable visions of the annihilation of humanity by river, wind and fire stamped on our consciousness. And in the process, they use various literary means to commingle the individual elements and agents to make it almost impossible to individuate them. Achilles burns and blazes like fire, but the river has silvery eddies. And this can obscure clear understanding of cause and effect, the full extent of human responsibility or helplessness, and the full extent of the autonomy of natural forces, their ability not only to fight back against human interference, but to act entirely spontaneously. In 1975, James Redfield wrote an influential anthropological study called Nature and Culture in the Iliad. I'm proposing something slightly different to fit the 21st century, the environment and humans in the Iliad. I'm writing a book arguing that the Iliad exposes the contradictions underlying the environmental crisis which we humans have created. I think it's the foundational document of the mindset of the Anthropocene. The entire poem can be read ecologically as exposing the contradictions inherent in the abuse of the natural environment entailed by routine deforestation to acquire timber for housing, heat, shipping, fortifications, funerals and watchfires. Further deforestation was required to clear pastoral land for the grazing of livestock, especially cattle, consumed with such abandon in feasts and sacrifices and rituals of exchange. The timber required to fuel the forges that produced the massive quantities of metal, especially for arms and armour, was also a huge factor in the rapid deforestation of the littoral of the Eastern Mediterranean, and it's never recovered from it. David Attenborough has described historical deforestation as the crucial blow to the Mediterranean world. And Simon Sharma in Landscapes and Memory talks of cultural reforestation, where literary and visual imagination works to replant in fiction diminished woodlands. Shakespeare's plays give us the Forest of Arden at a time when British deforestation was becoming irrevocable. But in the Iliad, there's little attempt even to imagine a more harmonious relationship between humans and the environment. The loggers' axes resound cacophonously in every episode. The elemental showdown with the river provides the climax to Achilles' day of utter rage after he hears of the death of Patroclus and he's engulfed by a black cloud of grief. He collapses in the dust, smearing his face with ashes, tearing his hair with his hands. His lamentation and that of the slave women seized by himself and Patroclus arouse his mother Thetis, who emerges from the sea to approach him. He tells her that life means nothing to him until he's killed Hector. Thetis responds weeping that his own death will follow swiftly on Hector's. But Achilles tells her not to attempt to dissuade him from avenging Patroclus. And it's this that prompts her to go to Hephaestus to ask him to make new armour for Achilles. This extraordinary dialogue occurs the day before Achilles' incomparable, terrifyingly berserk rampage, thus setting it up as one which will lead as inevitably to his own death as to Hector's. And that casts a bleak metaphysical light on all that is to ensue. This hero refuses his last chance to save himself from death of Troy, elects to die after winning glory. Now, while they've been speaking, the battle over Patroclus' corpse has continued on the battlefield unabated. Hector is about to gain control of the body. Hera sends Iris, the rainbow goddess, to urge Achilles to action now, even though he hasn't got any new armour. Iris tells them he can nevertheless go and show himself to the Trojans from a distance to implant terror into them and perhaps grant the Achaeans a breathing space. Athena protects the unarmed superhero with her aegis, a golden cloud over his head and blindingly bright fire issuing from his body. Man and elemental force become indivisible. With divine help, Achilles is virtually turning into fire itself. And Hera long similarly describes the visual effect of his supernaturally enhanced appearance. It was like this situation. When smoke emanates from a city and reaches far to the sky, from an island which enemies are besieging, and they contend all day long in hateful war from their city walls at sunset, The beacon fires flame up, one after another. The glare springs up high for people who live nearby to see. That's in case they can come in their ships to ward off harm. So Achilles looks exactly like what he represents as the living instrument that will ensure that the besieged city of Troy will be placed in parlous danger of destruction by fire. Looking as if he's on fire, he strides to the trench and bellows, and Athena joined in his shouting. 3 times he bellows, stupefying the Trojans and their horses. They were thrown into confusion by the volume of Achilles' bronze voice, which sounded as clear as a trumpet when murderous enemies are besieging a city. And in the chaos, 12 of their own warriors died at the hands of their own fellow soldiers from what we call friendly fire. At last, the body of Patroclus is retrieved by the Greeks. Hera makes the sun go down. The Trojans bivouac for the night outside the city, while the Achaeans prepare Patroclus for his funeral. Meanwhile, Hephaestus forges the new arms for Achilles, including his shield. The next day, Achilles and Agamemnon resolve their difference, but Achilles swears he will touch neither food nor drink until he's avenged Patroclus. Zeus is concerned and sends Athena to bestow nectar and ambrosia upon him to keep him from hunger. Achilles has already been turned visually into the equivalent of the element of fire itself, and now his separation from normal human experience, his temporary participation in the realm of the divine, is further emphasised by his unforgettable arming scene. His teeth could be heard gnashing. Both his eyes blazed like flaming fire. Unbearable grief sank into his heart. In his rage against the Trojans, he donned the gifts of the god that Hephaestus had laboured to forge for him. First he put round his shins the fine greaves fitted with silver over the ankles. Secondly, he fixed the breastplate round his chest and cast the bronze sword studded with silver over his shoulders. And then he took hold of his great solid shield, and from it emanated gleam like the moon. In a second, longer and far stranger simile, the gleam coming from the shield is likened to a natural element that's been tamed by nature, a fire burning in a human residence, but which causes emotional pain to the other humans who cannot tame nature. It was like when the shining light of a burning fire can be seen from the sea by sailors, and it burns high up in the mountains in an isolated refuge, but the storm winds carry them against their will out across the fishy sea, far away from their friends. Achilles' war equipment may be very beautiful, but it bodes misery. The fire men have made to help them survive has a far more sinister additional function. It illuminates all that men who've tried to tame the seas in their timber ships can lose if natural forces are not compliant. And Achilles completes his arming scene by donning his helmet, which shone like a star, and grasped his spear of Pelian ash, the foreshadowing of ancient literature of the tragic deforestation of Pelion in Thessaly would take another lecture to account for. The next book opens with Zeus asking Thetis to convene a divine assembly, and a strange emphasis is placed on this invitation because it's made not just to gods but also specifically to all the water gods to attend. We're told at the beginning of book 20, not one of the rivers was absent except Ocean, nor any of the nymphs who inhabit fair sacred groves and river sources and grassy meadows. It's curious that Oceanus was exempt. He's a self-maintaining circular flow. He's actually the last thing that Hephaestus has added to Achilles' shield to encircle and contain within it all the other cosmic and human scenes he'd painstakingly forged and crafted. Now, Oceanus is sometimes seen as the oldest of the Titans, but other archaic traditions grant him a primordial role in the creation of the universe, making him more ancient even than Zeus and the other Olympians. When Hera asks for Aphrodite's help, when she wants to seduce her husband Zeus, she invents a reason why she needs erotic assistance. She says she's going to visit her currently estranged foster parents, Oceanus, who's called the origin of gods there, Genesis theon. Aristophanes also records a tradition that the three primordial beings brought into existence by Eros were Uranos, Ocean and Gaia. And the Orphic hymn to Oceanos calls him imperishable and eternal and the origin of both gods and men. So Oceanus' status relative to Zeus must always be ambiguous. In the accounts of all the gods but Oceanus, Zeus says that the gods, including these river nymphs, can return to the battle and assist the side each favours, but actually they soon take their seats to watch. Achilles searches for Hector and he nearly kills Aeneas, but Poseidon, despite supporting the Achaeans, rescues Aeneas. Then Achilles kills several Trojans. When he kills Hector's brother Polydorus, Hector charges against Achilles and has to be rescued by Apollo. Achilles continues slaughtering Trojans in the most savage Aristeia in the entire Iliad, and some of his victims are associated with rivers or the elements. Iphition, the son of Naiad, Otrynteus, born in the lands of his ancestors by the Gygaean lake and the river Hyllus that teems with fish and eddying Hermus. The slaughterhouse narrative of Book 20 concludes with two similes helping us understand the sheer force of the furious energy driving on Achilles. He's sequentially compared both to a force of nature destroying all in its path without the involvement of humans, and to a man harnessing nature to compel both animals and plants to render him a livelihood. He charges on as a god-kindled fire rages through the deep ravines of a parched mountainside, and the deep forest burns, and the whirling wind drives the flame on in every direction. The horses drawing his chariot trample on corpses and shields, spattering blood everywhere. Like the bulls which a man yokes to tread white barley on a well-built threshing floor, and the husks are quickly peeled beneath the hooves of the bulls as they bellow loudly. Natural disaster? Or man forcing a living from nature? In his moment of abject fury, Achilles seems inseparable from either. And with these similes, Achilles rages on into the next book, driving the Trojans forward, arrives in his first line at the fair-flowing river Scamander, Xanthus, whom we're reminded is the son of Zeus himself. And half the Trojans are forced to jump into the river like locusts driven on by wildfire. Achilles leaves his spear by a tamarisk bush, leaps in after them with only his sword, and their hideous groans can be turned as the river runs with their blood. They're like fish trying to escape an enormous dolphin. Achilles' rampage pauses as he captures the 12 young Trojans he intends to sacrifice on Hector's pyre and sends them off to the ships. But then he resumes his killing spree. And details were given concerning the last two warriors that he slays keeps our focus on the twin notions of natural catastrophe and human exploitation of nature. Lycaon is a son of Priam, whom Achilles had previously captured when the youth was cutting down shoots from a wild fig tree, a non-renewable resource, in his father's vineyard. He was going to use them to make the sides of a chariot. Achilles had sold Lycaon into slavery, but Lycaon's release had been transformed by a ransom of over 300 cattle. Achilles kills him, hurls him into the river, saying that the fish will lick the blood from his wound. Scamander will carry his corpse down to the sea, where more fish, will eat Lycaon's fat. This makes the river angrier, but he doesn't launch himself into open conflict with Achilles just yet. A recent arrival at Troy is Asteropaeus from Paeonia in northern Macedonia. He's the grandson of the Macedonian river Axius, now called the Vardar. And he stands forth from the river to face Achilles, and Xanthus, the river god, puts courage in this grandson of a river's heart. And in the warriors' altercation, Asteropaeus stresses his descent from a mighty river. He doesn't shame himself in combat either. He's ambidextrous, and he's also unique in the Iliad in drawing blood from Achilles when he hits his forearm. But of course Achilles prevails, and his boast over the dying man he reintroduces the focus on his victim's descent from a river. It may have made Asteropaeus mighty, but Zeus is mightier than rivers, so descendants of Zeus must be mightier than descendants from rivers. Achilles includes Xanthus in his taunt, suggesting that Asteropaeus should ask him for help, but that it might not be a good idea. And now Achilles makes a fascinating claim about the relative status in the universe of rivers, ocean and Olympian Zeus. Achilles claims that even Achilleus, nor Ocean himself, claim equality with Zeus, isopharidse. Even Ocean is afraid of Zeus's lightning and thunder. But this is a rhetorical claim, not a statement of fact. And the ease with which the river, who is of course himself a son of Zeus, is about to vanquish the great-grandson of Zeus and son of Thetis, and that certainly calls the veracity of Achilles' claim into question. The fish devour the fat around Asteropaeus' kidneys, and Achilles kills 7 more Paeonians before Scamander reaches breaking point and speaks to Achilles. The river likened himself to a man, spoke from out of the deep ripples. And it's at this point we rejoin the narrative of the Iliad where my talk began. Achilles cannot equal the river in combat, and 2 similes point to man's inability to control nature without consequences, and their utter helplessness in face of a river that, without human intervention, has become a total threat to human survival. We've reached the moment when the mighty Achilles seems inevitably about to be destroyed by the river whose course he's obstructed and who has now broken his banks to pursue him across the plain. Human excellence and human technology in the forging of arms have met their limits in the form of retaliation from the natural world. Only supernatural intervention can prevent Achilles from succumbing, and it comes in the form of Poseidon and Athena. They assume human form, clasp his hands. Poseidon tells him that the river will soon give him respite and that he must continue to drive the Trojans back into Troy. And given new strength by Athena, Achilles now faces the river again. The river has difficulty now in withstanding him, but the river has not run out of resources. There are many other rivers to call upon. Scamander is still full of rage, Menos, and in his wrath he raised himself on high, turning his surge into the form of a crest. He calls on his brother river Simois to his aid. And in one of the most terrifying speeches in the Iliad, river god exhorts river god. Come quickly to help me, fill your streams with water from your springs, arouse all your torrents, raise a huge wave, stir up a mighty roar of tree trunks and stones. Scamander predicts that Achilles' strength, beauty and even arms won't be able to save him. They'll lie deep beneath the marsh, covered up with slime. And as for him, I will enfold him in sand, pouring over him a layer of silt beyond measurement. The Achaeans will not know where to gather his bones. Under such a depth of mud, I will conceal him. And this is one of several images the Iliad offers us of all traces of human activity being erased and hidden from later view by the action of elemental forces and gods. In Book 15, the Trojan battalions pour over the bridge, led by Apollo, and he kicks down the Achaeans' wall as easily as a child playing on the seashore who's built a house of sand and then kicks it down again and destroys it. The poet describes how even the last vestiges of the Greek fortifications were obliterated after the war by Poseidon and Apollo, who inundated the shore for 9 long days before Poseidon smashed every last beam and stone away with his trident and made the coast of the Hellespont smooth again and covered the beach with sand. Now, these images implicitly negate the poem's claim to lend immortality to the heroic warfare it narrates by revealing a physical world where all signs that humans had ever existed have been obliterated. After summoning Simois, Scamander gathers all his force and he's about to overwhelm Achilles. He spoke and arose, churning and seething from on high against Achilles. boiling with foam and blood and corpses. The purple blood of the heaven-fed river stood towering above him and was about to take down the son of Peleus. It takes another Olympian to rescue Achilles from the river's redoubled fury. Hera now intervenes. She tells her son Hephaestus to send forth fire, which she says she will exacerbate it by rousing western and southern winds from the sea to fan the flames. The fire will destroy all the Trojan dead and Trojan battle gear. Hephaestus is to burn up the trees that line the river's banks and not cease until she tells him. Hephaestus obeys. The fire flies across the plain, burning all the corpses and drying out the soil. And in a peculiar simile, the process is likened to the effect of the north wind, Boreas, drying out a rain-sodden field at harvest time, randomly bringing joy to its farmer, a natural event for which man is not responsible, which can work in their favour as well as to their detriment. But now Hephaestus turns his flames against the river, and here the poet produces the very opposite of the familiar classical locus amoenus describing idyllic pastoral scenes, lines about the destruction of flora and fauna. Burning were the elms and the willows and the tamarisks. Burning were the lotus and the rushes and the galingale that grew in abundance by the river's lovely streams. In sore affliction were the eels and the fishes in the eddies. They were tumbling in all directions, tormented by the blasts of wily Hephaestus. Burning, too, was the mighty river. Now that is truly a dystopian vision of organic life being annihilated by a fire, which is, ultimately, nature's response to gross pollution caused by human acts of warfare. A climactic half-line that says even the mighty river himself was alight must today prompt memories of the appalling incidences of burning rivers caused in recent times by human pollution, usually oil or chemical spillage. The Mayu River in eastern China burst into flames on March the 5th, 2014. Its waters were fearfully polluted by chemicals, oil and untreated sewage from factories upstream. The flames reached 16 foot high, destroyed cars parked along the riverbanks. In 1969, the Rouge River in Detroit, encircled by petroleum industry works, caused nearby oil tank storage buildings to explode and rendered the city's air unbreathable, and there are many such examples. At this point, Scamander, on fire, gives in. He decides it's not worth the sacrifice of his own self-interest for saving the Trojans. The river is responsible for its own ecosystem. Who cares if humans fight? Now, of course, the gods go to fight each other until it's time for Achilles to face Hector. But the real point of the Scamander sequence is that the battle between the Achilles and the river and the fire god projects the eventual consequences of the entire wasteful mode of production. Hephaestus was last seen bronze smelting for war, but now plays the key role in the destruction of the entire natural environment and the wrecking of the entire Scamander ecosystem. None of this would have been necessary had the Achaeans never made war on Troy in the first place. None of this would have happened if Achilles had not extended the effects of his rage beyond humanity to the natural world and so carelessly polluted and distorted the very watercourse of Scamander. So in conclusion, by developing an ecological consciousness and reading Iliad 21 eco-critically to expose it, I think we can perhaps read Achilles' wrath in a way that can help us begin to heal the rifts between humans and the environment and develop a better way of life in which Homer's phantasmagoric dystopian visions of elemental strife and chaos never become actual. In this better way of life, humans, plants, animals, rivers and fire can flourish in reciprocal cooperation rather than antagonistic mutual disruption. There must be a way for us to relinquish our rage, make watercourses through our orchards which do not do such damage to our rivers that they retaliate against us like Homer's Scamander does. Thank you very much.